what are the things that are rights for certain groups, and what are some of the things that have been violated to do these things to make it allowable for you to be able to have these privileges.
It is amazing to have you here. So, this is the virtual installment of Pizza and Politics. But unfortunately, there's no pizza today. But we just wanted to start off and ask, how do you feel that pineapple pizza?
I love pineapple on pizza. I'm like, so that's another thing. I think that there's a lot of people who think that pineapple on pizza is gross, but I think that it's awesome. It's like literally my favorite is Hawaiian, because I think that Asian American flavors have a lot of salty and sweet, and there's like a lot of that going on. So like kettle corn, I'm into, I'm into like the salty sweet combo.
As an assemblywoman, would you mind explaining for our viewers what your job entails and what you tend to do on a day-to-day basis?
So my day to day is very different now than it used to be. My day to day before would be that 6 months out of the year, I am in what's called legislative session. And so legislative session would make it so that I am up in Albany from January to like the end of June. Every single week, I'm up there for like 3 to 4 days out of the week. And then during budget times, I'm there the entire week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, however long it takes. And then at the end of the session, I'm also there for 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks straight without, any breaks at the end of session. And day to day, it would be like committee meetings, committee hearings, public hearings, going into legislative sessions. We're then voting on the floor and trying to pass these laws, right? So we're like doing research for bills, on bills, hearing about bills, trying to make it so that we have a good, powerful legislation to be able to run the state. I think that, off session times, like we're in our district office usually, and what we're doing is usually trying to make it so that, we have meetings with all of the stakeholders of different things, talking to constituents. And throughout the year, of course, my staff are also helping to make sure that, my constituents have everything that they need. We're doing like mobile district offices, I'm doing town halls, etc., to help people to understand like all the different steps that we're taking for, the legislative year. But right now, with all this stuff with the pandemic, we have really kind of shifted to be like a catch-all, which isn't very healthy and also isn't supposed to be that. But we've seen that, our federal government, our state government, our city government hasn't really, done what it's needed to protect our communities. And so we really started to see that, we had to be the place, and our neighbors were the ones who were stepping up, and we were the ones who were trying to like get people to step up and help out. And that part's a little bit hard right now. So like, making sure that we had PPE, making sure that we had food, making sure that we had culturally acceptable and language access to services, and all of these different things that a lot of folks were not thinking about. Like that was kind of like where we were trying to plug in and help to bridge that gap, right? And then, I had to argue for more funding, just to even bring the funding that was already owed to our nonprofit organizations that were actually doing all this work on the state level. Like these are things that we had to do. So it's changed our day to day a lot. But, I think that what I realized is that, the important thing about this office is that, hey, like, I'm sitting in it now. I'm sitting in this seat now, and I think that what it has to happen. And there's no job description really. It's really about making sure that our constituents and folks can get the services that they need.
Recently, there's been a focus on race-based injustices and violations of rights. How do you go about the process of protecting the rights of Indigenous people and people of color?
Well, I think that the first step is, again, acknowledging that our systems, which are currently existing, are excluding people of color, are excluding particular communities, and benefiting certain other communities. And I think that it's super important to understand that, you know, it's not just like, oh, these perspectives are now shifted outside. Like, it doesn't take um only just like a couple of people saying like, oh yeah, that's racist, but it also takes accountability, right? It takes accountability, and it also takes people taking responsibility. And I think that, the first step is always acknowledging, right? So acknowledging that our system is built a certain way, but then also acknowledging that some people are just contributing to the way that the system is. And also, we need to make sure that we have every single piece of our legislation, every single thing that we're doing, asking those questions. Does this close the racial wealth gap? Does this make it so that people have more accessibility? Does this make it so that we're inclusive of every single person who is a New Yorker? And how do we make sure that we're not continuing on race-based injustices and continue to violate people's rights, right? Like I think that we obviously need to have a budget that is inclusive, that is thoughtful, and makes it so that our communities are all able to get the funding and services that they need, right? A lot of people don't talk about this, but Asian Americans here in New York are the most impoverished ethnic group, and yet we get the least social benefits. Like this is like a clear disparity because of the model minority myth, because of the stereotypes that are put around different groups. I think that within the Asian American community, people don't realize like within the Asian American community that we're actually not one monolithic group, that there's a lot of different backgrounds for different people who actually need a lot of different kinds of help. Like language access is so important. Making sure that we're breaking down those barriers is so important. And I think that just even recognizing that there was a violation of rights like continuously, and that those violations have been written into how we govern is so important, right? I still remember when I was a young intern and I was first introduced to a amazing Native leader whose name is Billy Frank Jr. A lot of folks probably have heard of him. He's the guy who fought the fishing wars, and he was like a young person at the time when he was like protesting and got arrested like a bajillion times, fishing in what people say is our federal parks, but to them it's just their land. And I think that it's really important to kind of understand like how certain states, when they're talking about water rights, when they're talking about what things can be built on it, that they're actually violating certain things. Like, for example, in Washington State at the time, what was being debated was whether or not it was legal for Washington State to actually sell water, the actual water from the Columbia River to Dasani, which is owned by Coca-Cola. And I still remember very clearly that there were our tribal leaders who were talking about how, hey, like this is violation of our treaty, because guess what, if there's no water, there's no way of fishing. Like the fish won't live, the fish won't be there. So like below a certain amount, you can't sell this water, even when there's like obviously people would not have thought about that at all before. People understanding that water levels, like it's not like the minute you scoop the water it just gets replaced by more water. It's like, yeah, it comes from the ocean, guys, but at the same time, like there's if you're selling a particular amount of water and like that water is being taken all at once by a company, like that makes it so that there can be difficulties with the ecosystem, right, that it's supposed to be in. And so Billy Frank and a whole bunch of other tribal leaders were actually working on that when I was an intern, and I was like, this is fascinating, right? Because you never think about those basic things. When you turn on the tap, when you're turning on your lights, when when you're like living in a building that has built like 40 stories high, like what are the things that are rights for certain groups, and what are some of the things that have been violated to do these things to make it allowable for you to be able to have these privileges. Like these are all different things that people did not think about. So we have to think about how we're going about with every single bill, every single piece of legislation going forward, and then looking backwards, right? Like we have to like figure out how to correct a lot of things, but going forwards, like, are we asking these questions? Are we talking about how we're closing these gaps, how we're protecting folks, and how we're not taking more. Because right now it's like the escalator is like going towards taking everything, right? And so we have to actually press stop, and then we actually have to force it to go back, right? And we have to make it so that there are ways to not get onto the racism train, right? I don't know why, but for some reason people just think it's like a-okay to go around saying things like that are racist and messed up all the time. Like, our elected leaders have not demonstrated that they are understanding of how much their words can hurt people and how much power that they wield with their words. And I think that it's really important that people understand that.
We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. So for our final question, I wanted to ask, why do you think students should take the time out of their busy schedules to learn about the government?
I think that you can't affect change in things that you don't understand, right? So I think it's more important than ever to understand how your government works. The reason why I took on my internship was to be able to make change and to understand how government works so that I could. And I think that it's so important to get that bird's eye view. It's so important to understand like how these houses connect, how they're amazing, and how our government's checks and balances works, and like what is it that is like when people say the word democracy, what does it mean? Like when they're talking about like what it is that is like machine politics, what does that mean? Like really, like when they're talking about the establishment, what is established? Like what are these things that are this lingo that like people keep on saying, but like and throwing around honestly without really understanding the background and meaning of, like how does your government work, like how how politics in a local place works, like why is it that certain people think that they hold all the cards and they're the kingmakers of like the district or like the area or whatever? Why is it that people like feel like this group of people are the ones to like talk to, and like what this is all so important, right? Like my vote is the same as that guy's vote. Like why is it that that guy is like so much more important in the room when we're talking about like this kind of issue? Like what is it that is making things happen and tick and like move, and like how do these dynamics affect our rules, our laws, our legislation? I think that it's so important for folks to understand and for young people to really get to get. And I think that you know can't change the system until after you understand how it's done, right? Like I think that I am so effective, I think, when it comes to certain pieces of legislation and certain issues because I know how the legislature works. And like I was able to come in as a freshman knowing how the legislature works because I already worked in that system for over 15 years by that time, to really be able to kind of kick it off running, right? And knowing like, oh wow, like this is the person who connects this to this is how the houses work, this is how committees work, this is how I didn't have to start from scratch. Like just understanding the basics of like how government works makes it so that you're already a step ahead of like so many folks. So I think it's really important, whether or not you want to just fight to stop like kids from juuling, or like make it so that people who I don't know, love music, can appreciate artists more, or make it so that the dye that you're using for all of your clothes are making it so that they're not polluting the water. Like there's a lot of different things that people might be really interested in issue wise, but if you don't know how the government or the legislature works, that makes it so that it it prohibits a level of involvement and engagement that I think is so super crucial, right? I think that you can literally change those things that you care about if you understand just the mechanics of how the legislature works, who to talk to, how to talk to them, how to get into that room, and then you can change all of those things. So I think that that's like why it's so important.